Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you to the first monthly seminars of the Gulf Studies Unit for the academic year 23-24. We host Dr. Omar Al-Shihabi this evening. He will be presenting on the perceptions of the Saudi intellectual Dr. Abd-Elrahman Munif and his writings in the Oil and Development magazine. Dr. Omar Al-Shihabi is an academic from Bahrain and he is a professor and he holds many degrees, a BA, MA, and PhD from the UK. Previously, he was a visiting associate professor at the British Columbian University in Canada and at Gulf University for technological studies in Kuwait. And he worked for the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. His research interests are the demography of the Gulf, the modern history of Bahrain. He has a number of publications in Arabic on the demographics of the GCC and Gulf countries and the colonial traits and the impact of that in Bahrain. Dr. Omar, you have 45 minutes. Then we have a Q&A session for half an hour. Good afternoon to you all, and thank you for the invitation, and thank you for your attendance. I look forward to a very fruitful discussion. In this seminar, we will go back in history and explore what Abd-Elrahman Munif wrote about the question of oil and development. And this is a project in the making about Abuk Ali Khalifa Al-Kawari, Abd-Elrahman Munif, Khaldun Al-Naqib, Ghubash, and others. I think all of us, we know Abd-Elrahman Munif as a novelist, and he was, before that, he was a political scientist specializing in oil, and he wrote extensively. Before he became a novelist, he got his PhD from Belgrade University in 1961, and he researched the oil relations between the two world wars. I was not lucky enough to get hold of the text of his PhD thesis. The vast majority of his writings focused on the international relations of oil, especially pertaining to the United States and the Orient and the Arab world specifically. And he divides this history into different phases from the beginning until the early 70s. And our focus will be on his analysis on the developments in the 70s, which he considers very important historically in determining the relationship between the United States and the Arab world. Why should we focus on that? First, it's the 50th anniversary on this phase and 50th anniversary of his writings. And I am also interested in his historiography. That's why in the beginning the title was Oil and Development in the Thought of Abd-Elrahman Munif. If we call it oil and development in the historiography of Abd-Elrahman Munif, and we should focus into his periodization of history and why he chose these different periods in history. What I will argue today is he did that through focusing on pivotal periods when he focused on the change at the global level and the level of countries and at the local level, and also conjunctural analysis. And the conjunctural analysis, Gramsci is famous for, Stuart Hall, the British thinker, and we know Gramsci is that the crisis lies in the fact that the old is dying and the new is not born yet, and how he analyzed these periods, and specifically the period of the 70s when he lived through, and he critiqued many narratives of the oil-based international relations. My analysis will be taking into account two works, one published in 1973 when he was in Beirut, and the second group and the monthly issues of the Oil and Development magazine or journal, which was being published in Baghdad. He was the founding editor until the sixth year in March 1981, before he left Iraq in the midst of the Iran-Iraq war. Maybe it's a good idea to say something about the journal. The journal was the most widely published after Abdullah Taradi's the oil of the Arabs stopped, and and this was published by the Thawra publishing house, which was supported by the Iraqi government, and the slogan was towards deepening the awareness of the masses and to build a modern, prosperous Arab homeland. And it focused on the oil prices, planning the manpower and workforce, and also the American-Arab oil-based relations and the inter-Arab relations based on that. The late Jassim Lamtar was the editorial secretary, and Sami Ahmed Abbas Al-Amiri was a leading member of the Iraqi Communist Party, which was until 1968 the main political party in Iraq. Riyadh Abdul Karim was the art director of the journal, and many of them were prominent Iraqi communists. Until 1970, they were all imprisoned. And after 1968, and as we know, Abd-Elrahman Munif was a leading figure in the Arab Ba'ath Party after he resigned in 1962, and he turned more towards Marxism and leftist politics. And now, the journal itself had regular contributors, Dr. Muhammad Ali al-Mashta, also a communist, Dr. Jawad Hashim, who was planning minister from 68 to 71, and then he joined the Arab Monetary Fund. And there are also the Vector Parallel, a well-known American communist, a famous Nigerian, Abdullah Al-Taraqi, Hazim Al-Biblawi, Samir Amin. Also, on the left hand, there was this interview with Saddam Hussein, who was at that time deputy chairman of the Revolutionary Command Council, leading Al-Hamdani, Taih Abdul Karim, and other leading figures in the Arab Ba'ath regime. And this kind of attention was there, and it's reflected in the content of the journal between who consider themselves as opposition and they were imprisoned, and others who were pro-government. So because of this tension, ultimately the journal has ended. The journal had a local, regional, and international traits. They had the journal had many translated articles. I will not focus on the journal itself as much as I will on Abd-Elrahman Munif. Many issues and in his writings focused on the international relations, the oil-based international relations between the United States and the Arab world. We see how he viewed the history of relations built on and around the oil. He divides that into three periods. First, the period of oil concessions, which started before and during the World War II until the 1950s. So his view is, if we can divide the human history into periods, then the discovery of oil is one of the most important events. And despite the prominence of oil for human beings, he focused more on the oil-based relations and the economic aspect of that, especially in the Arab world, because most of the Arab world relied on the oil revenues to build their economies and prosperity. And it was the main reason for exploitation by the Western powers. And it was important for him to understand that through two factors. First, colonialism and capitalism, which determined the relations. And his focus in this period was to understand the role of the United States. The first period, as we said, made him look at the concessions regime after World War I, and he was trying to see what were the pivotal events which allow us to periodize history from one period to another. First, he looks at World War II, which ushered a new era of the victorious countries, focusing on the Middle East and the period of the Mandate. So Munif, from the beginning of the 20th century, oil was the prominent factor in this for the Western focus on the Middle East, determining its maps, drawing its maps and political entities, and it was the main reason behind the United States getting involved in the area. Before that, there were the missionaries. What's the name of Zuwaymer, the famous one who came to Bahrain, and others. But this involvement was, apart from the missionaries, was with the oil companies. And in World War I, during the vast attack of the Western world on the Ottoman Empire and the beginnings of the oil wealth, and then there was the struggle between England, France, and the Russian Empire was quiet and diplomatic until World War came, and it manifested itself in a more violent confrontation. So in this period, capitalism has developed, especially the American capitalists, and started exploring its opportunities outside the country and started invading, so to speak, underdeveloped countries, exporting weapon systems, and compete with the British arms industry, which entered the fray much earlier than that. So, according to his reading, the commercial interest and the linkage between industrial and commercial interest. There is a lot of talk about oil being a strategic commodity and an aspect of national interest. No, he thinks it's commercial interests which were the determining factors, and Hobson and Lenin, of course, which and his book about imperialism being the highest level of capitalism, and how this expanded outside. Munif is different than Lenin. Munif didn't think that this would necessarily lead to war and violence, and it opened the door for competition, yes, but not confrontation, and the competing powers would coordinate and divide their spheres of interest and their markets, and the crucible in which this was manifesting itself was the IPC, the Iraqi Petroleum Company, where all the imperialist interests have gathered together and divided the Iraqi oil between them, and under the pressure from American government, the American companies got some 24% of Iraq's oil after the discovery of oil in 1928 in Iraq. Then there was the agreement of the Red Line, so-called Red Line. So they took the quotas and divisions they agreed on in the case of Iraq and apply it elsewhere and divide the oil wealth between them along the same lines. And this was applied when the Qatar Oil Company was started in Oman. They were all established on the same basis, on the same quotas established in Iraq. That's why this period is referred to as the period of concessions, the Seven Sisters as they're called, with the oil producing countries. What do you mean by the concessions? Why was it called the period of concessions? Because each company is given the monopoly of discovering and producing oil. Kuwait, for example, was 1937. These contracts were imposed at a time when the producing countries were weak and poor, and they desperately needed financial resources for employment and development. So the companies used to give them a cut percentage of, say, 13% per barrel or something, and it was the companies who would determine the level of production and the price. So the rulers of these countries was nothing more than receive the check at the end of each month and organize the internal affairs of the workers. So Munif then, concessions was not the legal framework which organized the independence and the relationship between these countries and the oil companies. They also led to patterns of relations which meant that the countries were subjugated to the will of these oil companies, and the oil industry at best was nothing more than a small island amongst in a huge ocean with limited resources, and they made these concessions, made these countries and their governments subservient to the oil companies. So, according to Munif's understanding, was what this period was all about, and the relations was the basis on which the borders of these lands were drawn. And it suffices to look at the map of the Middle Eastern countries in the last 50 years. Of course, he wrote this in 1973, and saying without any exaggeration, you cannot find any map or any agreement without the impact of oil, the Sykes-Picot, the Versailles agreement, and the entities who started ruling the Gulf, and etc., etc. Therefore, in the simplest of analyses, the oil companies were the beginnings and for American involvement and interference in the region, and they paved the way for that. And he saw that the basis for American interference was oil companies. The role of the American company was almost non-existent, apart from pushing for the interest of these countries. So, in his understanding, the interest of the American government was an extension of the interest of the oil companies in the first instance. This is according to Munif's understanding of this period. This is the first period. So now we move to second period, the period of profit sharing. And it's interesting the titles he chose, how he determines these periods and how he moves from one to another. The second period, he considers that the Iranian nationalization of the Iranian oil company, it's called now it's called British Petroleum, and when Mossadegh's government was deposed, was the pivotal moment which formed the beginning of this period, which first of all, the old oil concessions in the eyes of many national governments were no longer sufficient, so there was a need for a new relationship. The oil companies did not carry out an accurate assessment of the people's needs, and this led to an exposure of the legal frameworks to more tension, and British Petroleum's rejection of Iran's demands led to the collapse of the legal framework, which led Mossadegh and his government to nationalize oil, and this of course led to a new crisis which ushered the new period. So therefore, the oil policy in a certain period reflects the needs of the country concerned. These countries are driven by their national interests, and after exhausting all other avenues, they find no other way open to them apart from confrontation, nationalization, and the companies realize that the previous arrangements are no longer viable, so this leads them to give some concessions to extend their presence to the longest period possible. So this period became a pivotal period. Nationalization failed, and the CIA and the British first deposed Mossadegh, and they brought the Shah, and they destroyed the nationalization process, and they repossessed the oil company. But what is important from Munif's point of view is they started pushing for a the new principle of profit sharing 50-50, which became the standard in the Middle East for the following 20 years. And Munif, once again, this historical movement was not driven by technological factors, but the changes in the political relations. He comments on the reason why nationalization failed. He says it requires both internal and external conditions. If these conditions are not there, or they're lacking one way or another, or the external factors, it becomes very difficult for the nationalization process to work. And we see now in this period, when he's talking to start building on that, until the third period starts, after the demise of the Musaddaq government, the Americans took 40%. They said to the British, we have a share too. And Munif thinks that the new colonial powers are learning from the old colonial powers. So now they began, the oil companies and the imperialist powers began to avoid any form of confrontation or any causes of friction. So they adopted the principle of profit sharing. The profit sharing was not driven by the producing companies. This was an initiative by the oil companies to avoid nationalization. Many people are of the opinion that this was an accomplishment, an achievement for the countries, oil-producing countries. But Munif thinks the opposite. He thinks it was the companies who wanted to do that to avoid nationalization. And also the saying that oil as a strategic commodity has gained currency in that period, and this was constantly present in Munif's writings, and he sees that from the first drop of oil being produced, the prices were never subject to the supply and demand principle, but the United States and other countries had a monopoly. They did not want to apply any supply and demand principles. They wanted to have their hands on the entire process, from discovery to extraction to marketing. There was no market in any sense. So in this context, as long as the Western governments viewed oil as a strategic commodity, they used to use it for political purposes. When Iran nationalized its oil, Iran could not sell its oil internationally because the British company increased its production in Kuwait to make up for the difference, and they banned Iranian oil from reaching the international market. So therefore, those who set forth these imperialist rules and others, they had their influence on the colonialized countries who felt it necessary to turn the equation and change the situation of national governments waiting for a check every 3 months, and the companies have all the secrets under wraps, all the production process, prices, everything. So this the colonializing powers monopoly on that made the colonialized companies to start searching for new ways, and this marked a change in the 1960s. as a result of three sets of factors which Munif emphasizes. First, the structural change in the international economy from 1870 until that time. America was the biggest producer and consumer of oil, and this lasted for about 1 century. But with the 1960s, this started changing with the rise in the cost of production, and America started becoming an oil importing country, and the international production has risen after World War II, and mostly was in America and Europe and Japan. In parallel, the international production increased by fivefold between 1950 and 1970, specifically in the Middle East, where it has increased 10 times. So the Middle East became the main producer, and the United States production rose by 74%. So after the U.S. Producing more than a half of the world's demands, the increase in the Middle East meant that the Gulf specifically and the Middle East became the leaders, and these countries were in need of the oil revenues to compensate for what they were lacking. According to Munif, and with the beginning of the 70s, profits were no longer the main concern for the United States. Now their interest is on energy supplies, cheap and reliable, and their focus on the region began to take new ways of exercising their influence and control. So Munif thinks that while profits were the driving factors in the first periods, now the strategic aspects, i.e. oil as a strategic commodity and national interest, became determining factors. This was the first set of factors, the changes in the structure of the world economy. The second set is related in the 1960s with the rise of liberation movements in so-called third world countries. So the old colonial powers were not able to keep up with the developments and resist the wave of resistance in the Middle East or the Latin American countries. So colonial interests became threatened. Hence comes the role of the new colonial powers. The rise of these nationalist movements was closely linked to the oil industry. What happened in the oil industry in this period was the biggest success, if we can call it that, and this is what Munif terms the third set of factors which created this change in the 60s, whereby the national oil companies began to be formed, and they started playing a role in the production of oil, consolidating relations between oil-producing companies, and the birth of OPEC in 1960. Munif thinks in the beginning OPEC did not play a big role, but with the 70s, OPEC became one of the most important in the world. So the producing countries began to determine the prices, and national companies started also determining policies, and we remember some prominent events in the 70s where we start the third turning point or the third pivotal period, and he focuses on the year 1972. We know what happened in 1973 with the oil boycott, but in 1972 was the year of Arab oil, and it was the pivotal moment of change into a new period. He thinks the new Muammar Gaddafi's government, which was only about 2 years old, when they started imposing new conditions prior to that, 1970. In mid 72, Iraq, Algeria, and Libya had nationalized oil. This was different than Iran's case because nationalization became successful in 74, 75, 76. In the Gulf also they started nationalizing things, started with Kuwait and Saudi Arabia and Qatar. And this was a decisive factor in stripping the legitimacy of the colonial powers. And Munif thinks nationalization was the biggest turning point, and in many of his articles he alluded that when he says oil nationalization is the beginning of a new era for Iraq, the Arab nation, and the third world countries, and this ushers the beginning of a new era, the beginning of a continuous revolution and change. Today, this language is a language of exaggeration, but in those days, this was really the big change that Munif saw it, and today we may think twice before use these terms. At that time, victory was not at the disposal of Arab countries. They were more used to defeats than victories. So the first time a third world country manages to push back against colonial powers, and the oil companies were a special kind of companies. It was more than a government. In fact, it used to draw borders, run the countries, and nobody can say no to their demands. So the mere fact that this was challenged exposed these oil companies, foreign oil companies, as paper tigers, and eventually they fell, and with their defeat all the illusions were disappearing, fast disappearing, and this benefited the consuming countries, industrialized countries. They started receiving oil with fairer prices, because previously the foreign companies used to have a monopoly on the market. Now the relations between producers and consumers are done without any third party involvement, and a win-win situation is sought for both parties, and prices were determined according to the market, and exploitation was over. I think the developments of the oil markets later on testify to his vision. The terms we hear about today, about fairer prices, etc., more balanced prices, were not things you would hear about in those days, because all the marketing was done by the Seven Sisters, the major oil producing companies. So the companies could no longer market the oil, so they had to look for markets, and this has created the oil market that we know today. Anyway, without delving into much details, we can go back to what Munif is saying. If nationalization was the first oil revolution, this was followed by the 1973 war between Arab countries and Israel, and the boycott of Arab oil marked a second revolution, and this has marked a change in the relations And this war exposed the fact that the real problem which was facing humanity is not because of the oil prices, but on how to use and exploit this oil. And he thinks that at that time the world has entered a new pivotal period with the birth of a new world order. And what happened with nationalization was not the spark which caused many fires. In fact, it ignited an entire new revolution and period of change, and forced the capitalist countries to wake up to the fact that the world is no longer their own world, and there are new equations that should be taken into consideration. And he thinks that this period does not stop with oil. We're not only talking about oil, but it had repercussions at the international political and economic world order. And this, when he wrote in 1977, saying that the nationalization of 72, 73 will still be in play because they require more crystallization of visions to enter a new period. And now we are seeing a crisis. The old system is dying, the new is not born yet, and he sees, and many others do, that too, that a new economic world order led by third world countries is facing up to an old economic regime led by the United States and based on new formations, because America is not going to sit idly watching what is happening. And this is what he was focusing on in this period of his writings. He doesn't think that the problem is a problem of energy. And again, he is analyzing from a Marxist point of view. The crisis is structural and linked to the international economic system, because this economic system has its own root causes for demise built in, and this is almost a direct quote from Marx. And this was a system which was imposed by the strong and turned it into a law. But at the period of the crisis in the beginning of the 70s, Bretton Woods financial system collapsed in that period, and other crises began to appear. The energy crisis, we call it the oil boom. The West calls it the energy crisis, which led to a change in the international economic relations. And the talk in the West was all about oil prices. He says this is not the basic problem. The problem lies in the formation of relations between developing countries and industrialized oil importing countries, and the need for organizing relations at this level. So when he talks about a formula of exchange as a problem facing the international economy, Munif and his editorial board were following the steps of dependency school, according to an Argentinian thinker. And Abdullah Taregi and Munif used to draw on the Marxist trends in unequal exchange, as it was known. Al-Ghair Emmanuel also, Samir Amin picked that up, and Samir Amin was a co-contributor in the journal, and they say there is the exchange of basic commodities like oil are underpriced in relations to the manufactured goods, and of course the workforce is an important factor. The salary or wages of an employee in a developing country is different than that in an industrialized country. So we should view this from the point of view of the wider scope of relations, because oil is one commodity which has manifestations in the unbalanced relations, and the international economic order has to be reviewed. And the Arab world was at the heart of this struggle, because oil was at the heart of it all, and the oil was the main reason for colonialism and Western interference and influence. And he had a pan-Arabist point of view, and he viewed the Arab world as one unified unit. But there are discrepancies, however, from at the economic level and oil production and the movement of capital and people and commerce, and at that time was at a very low ebb. Now probably is even worse than 1973. What I'm presenting to you now is what he saw and many others saw about the competing relationships about this pivotal period. On the one hand, was the liberation of oil and the Arab world, and to start a new international economic order, NIEO. And this was at that time had a lot of attention and focus by developing countries. And the group of rules upon which this new order should be established on was to liberate the wealth and start new relations based on an exchange of benefits, fairer prices. And this started with the non-alignment movements meeting in Algeria in 1973, and the call for a new international economic order adopted by the General Assembly. Now it's all gone and finished, but at that time was some 50 years ago, was 1974. So he insisted on a new, clear, applicable strategies, timetables, clear timeline, because you cannot accept a new order without the necessary pressure. And he thought that OPEC can play a leading role in this through their financial resources, and it was in fact the first block of developing world countries, third world countries. So he thought it was possible to create a change in the international balance. Munif harbored no illusions about this. He knew there are counter forces. They were moving to achieve their own objectives, of course, led by the United States. And he thinks that it was America's way of doing things then, as it is now, is controlling the wealth of these countries and linking that with the American economy, to also the dependency policy. Once again, he uses this term through the aid packages and loans, etc. This has created change in the beginning. The United States, some countries floated the idea of sharing rather than nationalization. Ahmed Zaki al-Yamani was a leading caller for this, to rethink concessions, profit sharing, and then nationalization. But now the talk was on sharing. This time round, this did not succeed. And Munif says, hence a new policy comes into existence which goes beyond mere sharing. This was in April 1973. April 1973. This was the last sentence with which he closed his book in 1973. It was rather prophetic, in fact, and he talked about the same thing in the journal itself, Oil and Development, and in this he says that the imperialist power led a huge campaign led by the United States to re-invade the third world countries and impose its hegemony, and the American way was aimed at imposing economic hegemony to increase the dependency. And in the last 5 years of his writings, he focused on this, on starting a club which has become now the International Atomic Energy Agency, technology transfer, and other ideas were talked about. And also Bretton Woods was the previous rule that collapsed, and the dollar, which was pegged to the gold, there was a disengagement of that. It became a fiat. It's no longer linked to oil or any commodity. The dollar has become now to become the basic reserve currency. Now this is a given, but in those days that was new. And why was this important and serious? Because if that was to be done, that would have given the United States practical control over international commerce. And if we seek exchange, then the basic element here is the currency. So if one country controls the currency, of course the whole principle and concept collapses. And the most serious thing at that time was that OPEC start pricing its basket of currencies with a new currency. And the special drawing rights, as it was known at that time, the assets that the IMF talked about, and discussions within OPEC reached a period whereby in the first part of 1975, the Kuwaiti oil minister Al-Kadhimi and the Saudi Ahmed Zaki Al-Yamani said that we are agreeing on in agreement on this, and they are looking for the best way to price oil, but this did not materialize. And the American Secretary of State Blumenthal made an agreement with Saudi Arabia whereby the share of Saudi Arabia was increased in the IMF, and the linkage with the dollar was there from the Aramco days, but that had ended. This can be dealt with more deeply, but let's set that aside. This is one strategy based on currency. The other strategy was which had a more serious impact, and he devoted a large space of analysis for, was the weapon sales to the region, especially that the United States was pushing the oil-producing countries in the Gulf to buy more weapons. In the past, it was Iran. Now the focus was on the Gulf region. He thinks oil sales have significance apart from impacting the balance of payment for the United States. The countries which want to arm themselves at this level are the oil companies which have an impact on the oil market locally and internationally, and this shows the threat by the American drive towards arms sales. So if this is not exploding at a military and weapons level, it can be done at a political level. This was before arming the arm race in the region was expanding, and the so-called alliance of the dollar and gun made this region probably the biggest weapons market because of the oil revenues. Munif also focused on the partners that America was trying to gather around her. Israel was spearheading the American strategy, and there was a complete organic link between Israel and America because Israel is an extension of America and its interests. So therefore, any courtesy towards these countries will take a lot of attention in the media just to pretend that there is some change occurring in this policy. Israel, in its alliance with the United States, presents the possibility of change that will hinder the attempts by the countries in the region to emancipate and achieve their prosperity. And of course, when you ignore important factors at the social and economic level and force the countries to spend their revenues on weapons, Israel is the bridge the United States uses to deplete the area of its resources. He thinks Israel is a tool of America. When some people think that the Israeli lobby ruling America, he thinks that Israel is the tool in the hands of the United States to impose its hegemony, although it's not the exclusive tool, and there is a number of tools which require bridges to be built between Israel and America and some regimes in the region. This is in 1978, 77, 78. In that period, it was not possible to establish this triangle as he saw it, and the United States was the main pivot for that. I don't know what he will say if he was around today to see the weapons supplied to Israel to bomb Gaza and the intelligence provided to it, etc., etc. The other countries he saw as being under the American umbrella, in his opinion, are the Arabian Gulf countries. And he says the United States in that period is focusing on the Arabian Peninsula and the Arabian Gulf and paying a great deal of attention because they represent the main weight so far as oil is concerned, both then and in the future. So therefore, America was empowering certain regimes to bear the burden in the future and impose its will on their public policies to be part of the Western public policies or in parallel and in support of that. Not only in the neighboring countries, America also goes to faraway continents which are thousands of miles away, and we see that in Africa and elsewhere. This was 1979. I don't know, we can call this a future vision or long-sightedness. It's also noticed that the ruling governments in most of the oil-producing countries are of a conservative nature, and this has served the interest of the United States. We don't need any evidence. The political trends in these countries are completely in line and coordinate with America. Of course, in addition to that, the dependency and the linkage with the United States market or the capitalist market. So the local markets and the American capitalist markets are linked strongly. And this final part he focused on a great deal, and he said the petrodollars are reinvested, and between 73 and 85, 2/3 of the financial surplus in the world was in the Arab Gulf oil producing countries. Ultimately, they all went to the United States, and when they were deficits in the 80s, most of the surplus was spent. And these countries, of course, cannot change the nature of their relations with American companies without exposing their investments in America to risk and jeopardizing these investments. And this made them refrain from any substantive changes. That's why the United States consolidated its economic relations between the 1970s. It was the oil producing companies. Now it has reached levels the American government wouldn't have dreamt of, and this was a guarantee for perpetuating the economic task. 5 minutes and we'll stop. I think I'm almost there. This is one aspect. America started building these alliances, and the United States and industrialized states started dividing these countries. They divided OPEC and created new trends like conservative Gulf countries in particular. This was the main objective. The main objective of OPEC was a new world order, became fulfilling the world's needs of energy supplies. Ultimately, this led to an increase in the tensions in the area and an increase in the tensions between the OPEC members. Before, the focus was on relations between America, the imperial powers, and these oil-producing countries. In that period, OPEC did not have any strategic planning. It was not proactive. It was reactive by and large. All what they were trying to do is fulfill the needs, and the role of the organization has shrunk a lot as a result of these developments. During the period of the journal Oil and Development was in publication in the 70s of the 20th century, and the focus on not just international relations but international economic relations and the new avenues oil has opened, and he was or the journal was trying to focus on the need for a new international economic world order based on sovereignty, and the main obstacle for that was the attack by the United States and its allies on the region. And Munif's writings in that period was becoming more pessimistic because of what he thought would prevail. Then came the Iran-Iraq war in September 1980, or at least this is the official date. And then weapons, dollars, and oil exacerbated the situation and the divisions in the region and dashed any hopes of starting a new economic world order. And the March issue was the last issue of the journal, and he was asked to use the journal as a propaganda tool for the Iran-Iraq war. He did not accept that. He left Iraq, and Ali Khalifa al-Kawar in his memoirs says, when I visited Iraq, I visited Dr. Abd-Elrahman Munif, and I asked him, why didn't he publish my article on Iraq? He said, some members of the editorial board act as censors. For this reason, he resigned his editorialship, and he decided to leave Iraq and focus more on literature, the subject closer to his heart. So therefore, he in the oil and development journal did not feature a lot of his literature aspect, and the last time he wrote about oil, when he talked about the crisis which led to the birth of a new model, the new liberalism of the United States, which formed the international economic order for the rest of the 20th century. Of course, he talked about this period and the competing powers, and they called for an alternative economic system. This was probably the closest the world got to that. Now it's almost gone and forgotten after 50 years. And so in conclusion, I say revisiting this kind of methodology opens the way for more research and more understanding of that period and how to analyze it in the time frame, and maybe there will be a new pivotal period.
Thank you. We will now receive questions, and we will start with 3 questions. So for the first oil shock, when it was banned, why was oil depoliticized and it was no longer even a subject of conversation as a political lobbying tool? Speaking from the perspective of Munif, how did he interpret that? How did he explain that? Even though the speculations were optimistic, but in the late 70s, as you said, he was greatly pessimistic. How can we use the writing of Munif in understanding what is happening in the oil market right now and neutralizing it and completely depoliticizing it? Thank you. Peace be upon you. So you said something that grabbed my attention regarding the bridges between regimes and Israel and using them as tools. speaking of the principles of Abd-Elrahman Munif based on nationalist view of the world, and how he dared to express this opinion in his article in a region that would never accept such an opinion. I just wanted to ask you this question. Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Shihabi, we enjoyed your presentations remotely. Right now we have you face to face, and we are enjoying everything that you have spoken about. I believe that I've heard in this lecture that the oil companies took the initiatives of giving the right to producing countries to share profits. I've heard that. If that is truly what you said, then I greatly disagree with that. The party who initiated this sharing was Sheikh Abdullah Turaiqi, may he rest in peace. He initiated this when he was a minister of petrol and mineral wealth. He reformulated agreements signed with other countries in pricing and transfer of oil and excavations, and in specifying the rates of profit sharing. This is one thing. The other thing, or the other remark, is that Abd-Elrahman Munif was known in the Arab world as a novelist and at a high level of literature and culture, and I knew him personally. May he rest in peace. May they both rest in peace. I expected the thesis that you have presented to be specific to a figure or a persona that had a stance on decision-making, political decision-making in the industry of oil. I believe that we have symbols and figures in the Arab Peninsula, including Sheikh Abdullah Turaiqi, may he rest in peace, who were more influential or more giving or more prolific than Abd-Elrahman Munif in this regard, and many know Munif only as a novelist rather than an economist or an oil expert. His expertise in this regard is quite limited compared to other figures in Kuwait, such as Abdullah Turaiqi, who was a consultant in oil. So I believe there needs to be a correction on the specification of the party who took the initiative for profit sharing. Thank you so much for your remarks. First of all, again, I underscore that I express the opinions of Munif here. First, the profit sharing by 50%. First, this started in Venezuela, and Venezuela was the first place where they shared profits by 50%, and he did not disagree with that, but he thought that the reason behind the profit sharing by 50% was accepted and expanded and became prevalent was that because oil companies saw that it is suitable to face up to the worst situation. Of course, for them, the concession era was the best. But the concession era could not continue any longer. So would they go back to the issue of nationalization, such as what happened with Mossadegh? No, they thought sharing profit would be better. So they pushed towards the sharing of profits by 50%. They controlled that in production and in pricing. This did not change. They were the party controlling that in terms of pricing. However, the part that goes to the producing countries would increase. So we would share profits by 50%, but I will be increasing the prices of transferring oil, for example. So that they would make up for the increasing of profit sharing. So they moved along to this era because oil companies thought that it was not their initiative, but but they pushed towards it. They drove it to be achieved. This is, of course, his own perspective. If you are to ask me personally, I believe there was quite the interaction. And from my reading, from my humble reading of the history, this was driven by Venezuela and also the oil companies that saw that this was the best situation or the best scenario possible. Let's push towards it so that we don't have a worse situation. As for Abd-Elrahman Munif, and in terms of his role in political economy, Abd-Elrahman Munif did not have a role in influencing the industry of oil, such as Al-Turegi and other figures. Basically, he was an author and an analyst of these issues, and in that era he had a great reputation. He was a reputable figure, and he was recruited to be an editor-in-chief of the Journal of Oil and Development. He had a reputable in the 70s, and he was at a point where they wanted to recruit him to be a chief editor-in-chief of this journal. But afterwards he of course, this journal was quite popular in the Arab world after the Arab Oil Journal, which was edited by Al-Turegi, stopped being published. So at that time, he was known as an economist and a political economist. The first novel, he published his first novel in 1977. Before that, he was known as an expert in this issue, and he was selected as editor-in-chief for this journal. So my goal in this lecture was to highlight this aspect, which was completely actually disregarded or forgotten. People actually didn't know him as a novelist before that. But afterwards, he was known as an author. He didn't really have an influential role, but rather an analytical role. He was an analyst. He had a PhD, and he wrote about all these issues. So, reading all of his writing, which was really forgotten. Nobody remembers all of this writing. It was important to me. So this was an attempt to reread his writing and to understand the history of that era using his writing. And so this is connected to the question on how this could be beneficial for this time, how we can interpret the current times from his writing. This is a lengthy topic. We might have a disagreement in perceiving this issue, but the main aspect is that how did we get to this stage or this phase? There are many things that we can consider today, or things that we can consider take for granted. We wouldn't even think twice about them, such as the economic order and the currency is connected to the USD, the nature of the oil market. We do not think about nationalization and how this pivotal era took place to move towards nationalization, and how it was actually like an earthquake in that time. These things we should reconsider how we perceive these things, and how they are not for granted, and how they have evolved, and how we had the opposing forces that were in play. And this helps us understand this era. And there is also the aspect of understanding and interpreting the material factors and aspects of the situation. For example, why did they not weaponize oil or petrol, and why wasn't there the same dynamics in that era? After, for example, the war in October, at that time, nothing really happened. But right now, after the war, after the event in October, there's been continuous bombardments for a year now. So I believe that this is a part of it, how he used the school of dependency and the thoughts of exchange as principles that we can use to interpret the situation. It could be beneficial until today, and we can apply it to the oil market today, and how we are talking today as if the oil market is not politicized at all, and how we can fulfill the demand of the international market for oil. So this is also an aspect that we can look into. Of course, this is an open and lengthy discussion, and we could discuss it. We could have different opinions around it. There was another question, I believe. I forgot it. Oh, how he dared to say that the regimes were bridges. He was really a daring writer, and when he saw that his writing was no longer acceptable, he thought that it was better for him to leave this arena. He stopped writing. He said, I would not write things that I do not believe in, so he preferred to stop writing such opinions, and he focused on novels, writing novels. And this actually was a part of the reason why he resigned his post in the journal and was exiled or moved to Paris, France. Thank you so much, Dr. Umar, for this valuable lecture and for accepting our invitation to deliver your lecture at the center. This was a very interesting presentation. Perhaps you have mentioned the transfer from the concession period into the profit-sharing period, and the research helps us understand the career of Munif and his placement on the leftist and nationalist map of the Arab world. The journal that was being issued was affiliated with the Ba'ath party, and the Al-Thawra newspaper was also issued by Al-Ba'ath party. So in 1975 was the era of the progressive and leftist alliance, and the exit of Munif is not necessarily related to the Iraqi-Iranian war, but rather related to the oppression of this movement at the time. I might not have the full picture, but this might be part of the reason. This also a question about the moving from a period to another. In 49 in Syria and 52 in Egypt and 54 the profit-sharing agreement was signed in Iraq. So this was part of the context in the region. So let's ask about Munif's interpretation. If the 70s was a pivotal period, as he said, you said that Munif became more pessimistic. But if we are to think with the logic of Munif, what made this period not continue, not move on, not live on? Was it the front of the regional countries and the conflict between the backwardness and the progressiveness and the World War and the invasion of Kuwait, and the most important thing, which is the fall of the socialist camp? So let's think from the perspective of Munif and his logic. Of course, I've read some memoirs and some articles, and in early 70s there was a great fight to reach nationalization. There were great efforts from the states of the region to achieve nationalization. including Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, and other countries. But why did that not continue? This is my specific question. And I have an idea that I would like to discuss with you after the lecture. And thank you again. Last question. Thank you for your lecture. I cannot add to what you have said. What you have said is true. This was the early 70s was a pivotal period, and perhaps he did not focus on the domestic or interior situation in each country, but it was a transformational era, the independence of Gulf countries and independent movements that appeared in Dhofar and Oman. And in Kuwait in 1974, there was a strike which paralyzed the production of oil. It completely stopped the production of oil due to the strike of the workers in oil companies. And the role that was taken by Abdullah Nebari, may he rest in peace, in the parliament drove towards nationalization in the end of the day. So these strikes in oil companies drove towards the governments pushing towards nationalization, even though it was more gradual in Gulf countries compared to the direct nationalization which happened in other countries. So we can go back to your question. What created this fragmentation from the opinion and the opinion of Munif? This is all speculation, of course, because he stopped in 1981. But in the latest issues of the journal, he focused on these disagreements that increased continuously between the oil-producing countries and at the wider levels, the other developing countries saw OPEC as a liability because the non-oil producing countries need this oil and they are affected by the increasing prices and the deficits that they had, and led to the credit or the credit crisis that they had with the increasing interest rates in the USA and so on. And so he focused on all of that, and his he started fragmenting his view of the situation. The OPEC no longer had the same role in the late 70s. There were disagreements between oil-producing countries. There were armament in the region. There were disagreements between these countries, reaching the invasion of Kuwait, Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. So if you notice this from his writing in the journal, the focus in the beginning was on the relationships with the USA, and in the late stages his focus was on the relationships among the oil-producing countries or between the oil-producing countries and the oil-importing countries. He talked about the disagreements between the oil-producing countries, and his pessimism was growing with the years. And then he stopped writing altogether in 1981. So it is an open-ended question, but this is what he focused on during that era of time. Thank you, Dr. Umar, for this valuable lecture. We thank the attendees for their interaction. See you in our next monthly lecture on the 6th of October, digital inclusion. Thank you very much.